And welcome, everybody. My name's Juliet Oliver, and I'm the General Counsel at the SRA. And it's my pleasure to give you a very warm welcome to our third annual In-house Conference. And can I just say how fantastic it is to see such a full room and see so many people here today. As I mentioned last year, in the time I've been GC at the SRA, which is just over 10 years, the in-house sector has grown in size by about a third to around 34,500, and in influence, with solicitors increasingly playing a key role in helping over 6,000 organisations across the public and private sectors to behave legally, ethically, and fairly. I know many of you here today will have joined us in previous years, so welcome back. But whether you're a returning delegate or a first-timer, I hope you've noticed the increased focus we at the SRA have been placing on supporting the in-house sector over recent years. And from a personal point of view, I've really enjoyed and appreciated the conversations that I've had across the in-house community and the lively engagement and debate our work has generated. One thing that it appears we all have in common is a passion for making a difference, for bringing integrity and professional values to our work, and for supporting junior colleagues, and for promoting the unique opportunities you can get from an in-house career. In particular, over recent months, I've spoken to a number of groups and individuals about the new suite of guidance that we published in November last year. I've been really pleased to hear so much positive feedback on the documents, and particularly to hear how they've been used in practice. I've been told about junior solicitors using them to develop training materials and support team discussions on ethical issues. I've been told about senior solicitors sharing them with executive colleagues or holding sessions to discuss them with their boards. And I've also heard about professional advisors bringing them into their resources and advice for in-house teams. For those who haven't seen the guidance, and a quick reminder for those who have, this was prepared with help from members of the in-house community. And I want to give a particular thanks to members of our virtual reference group for all of their support with the project. The documents themselves include, firstly, guidance on identifying your client. This is a question which is something that's pretty straightforward in private practice, but can be quite tricky in-house, particularly in organisations with complex governance or group structures. And is, of course, the cornerstone to meeting your professional obligations, from avoiding conflicts to protecting confidentiality. And, of course, understanding whose best interests you need to act in, which is not always, in fact, perhaps in my experience, rarely the person you're taking instructions from or reporting into. There's also guidance on reporting concerns, and this aims to address head-on the difficult situation when things have gone wrong in client organisations, and to help solicitors to understand and navigate the competing obligations and pressures they need to balance in these situations while protecting their independence and their integrity. We've got guidance for solicitors conducting internal investigations, recognising that we're often the ones who are involved in investigating or identifying wrongdoing. And this gives some practical tips on how to safeguard the independence and fairness of investigations and ensure they provide robust and reliable findings. Due to popular demand, we also produced a separate guidance document, which is a sort of starter for 10 on privilege for in-house solicitors, which covers how to protect and preserve privilege. But it also flags the risk that employers might try to use privilege as a shield to prevent disclosing documents which, in fact, they should, or might just believe that copying a solicitor into correspondence or labelling it privileged will make it so. Finally, there's guidance which is directly targeted at employers, explaining a solicitor's role and professional obligations and what this means for those who employ them. And we have a separate summary which is aimed at boards, C-suite, and senior leaders. And we will, I know, be talking more about that final document in the first panel session today, and I'm sure we'll be referencing all of these materials at various points during the morning. So if you haven't looked at them yet, I hope you'll go away inspired to do so. The key aim of the guidance is to promote understanding in the community, and perhaps more importantly, in the organisations in which we work, around the value in-house lawyers bring in supporting good corporate governance and accountability, as well as lawful and ethical decision-making. And also around what solicitors can do to protect themselves and their ability to meet their ethical obligations. And to have a platform for seeking the support they need from their organisations to help them to do so. This came out of a recognition that across our various and diverse roles, in-house solicitors have some particular issues in common and face some specific ethical challenges. And of course, we've seen some of this come into sharp focus in the Post Office inquiry, looking at the wide-scale miscarriages of justice suffered by many hundreds of postmasters and mistresses and their families. We've gone on the record as saying that we have more than 20 live investigations into solicitors and law firms involved in the events, and they were hopeful we'll be able to launch prosecutions in some of the first cases in the summer of this year. These investigations cover a wide range of ethical issues and behaviours, not limited to in-house lawyers, and not unique to the in-house setting. And looking ahead, alongside the investigations, we'll continue with a programme of policy work looking at ethics and the rule of law across our regulatory functions. In the meantime, we'll be continuing to work with the virtual reference group to feed into our understanding of the issues facing in-house solicitors. And to further deepen our engagement with the in-house community, we've also recently introduced 8 large in-house teams working within very different organisations and different sectors into our regulatory management group, which involves ongoing engagement via a dedicated SRA regulatory manager. We'll also continue to develop the resources available on our website and are working on case studies to support our guidance, as well as short videos and vox pops from in-house lawyers discussing specific issues and themes. And we'll be recording some of these in the foyer around the edges of the conference today. So if you have any ideas about areas you'd like us to cover in our case studies, please come and grab a member of SRA staff and tell us. There are plenty of us here today, and perhaps members of SRA staff, could you put your hand up so people can see who you are? There you go. So we have lots of us here. There's also SRA staff in the foyer, where we've got a stall that we're manning out the front. And we also have 2 board members with us today. I think Simon and Nicola have joined us from our board. Would you mind putting your hands up so people can see where you are and who you are? Thank you. There's Nicola and there's Simon. So now you know who we are. Do please come and grab us and have a word with us. If you'd like to be interviewed and tell us about your own experiences of working in-house, your thoughts about the guidance or about the event today, you'll see a camera crew as well who's going to be around during the event and during lunch. And we're going to be taking some clips to add to our website. And Cerise is going to be leading that for us. There's Cerise over in the corner. So now you know where Cerise is. You can go and grab her and give her your thoughts. So more about what to expect from today. Well, firstly, hopefully no fire alarms. We're not expecting any tests. So if we hear one, please make your way out using the closest fire exit, and fire marshals will take you to the assembly point. But secondly, and most importantly of all, we're going to have some great discussions. There are more details in the programme, which you'll have been sent in advance of today, and there are paper copies available out the front. But just to give you a quick run-through. So I will shortly be chairing the first panel. This will be exploring the role of employers in supporting in-house teams and hearing some great perspectives across different types of organisation. We'll then hear from Dr. Jim Baxter from the University of Leeds. And Jim will be talking about the work he's been doing with the Law Society, carrying out some fascinating research and developing some resources, and he's going to touch on a new collaborative piece of work, which we will be working on together with him and the Law Society around whistleblowing. At 11:15, we'll break for refreshments and give you time to network and visit the stands. And when we come back after the break at 11:45, we'll then have a panel discussion on workplace culture and the relationship between this and ethical behaviour. And then our final session will give us a really fascinating insight into AI, technology, and innovation for in-house teams, looking at some of the opportunities there and also what this might mean for the in-house lawyer of the future. We aim to close by 1:30 and really hope that you can stay on for some lunch and some more networking then. As ever, we have some excellent speakers who've agreed to come along and share their expertise and their views. So please do ask questions. During each panel, we're going to come to you to ask if you've got anything to ask or to share. So do please be thinking about what you might want to say. And if you put up your hand, we've got some colleagues with roaming mics around the room, and we'll get them over to you. And if you'd like to share your thoughts and insights on social media, please do go ahead. You'll see on the programme we've got a dedicated hashtag for the day. And if we don't get to your questions, or you prefer to raise them on a one-to-one basis, as I said, there's an SRA stand out in the foyer. And we've got colleagues from both our policy team and our ethics helpline on the stand. And they're there ready to answer your questions. And as I said, we've got members of the ethics team, so they can give you one-to-one advice if you've got some issues you want to talk through with them. We also have colleagues from the Law Society outside here today who can answer your questions and will be available to help you talk through their resources. And finally, we're going to be filming the events today for our in-house webpage. So if you have colleagues that haven't been able to come along, please do let them know that they can watch the recording. Our camera people are at the back of the room. Do please shout and let them know if you don't want to be recorded. And if you're talking about real-life issues, then do please be careful naming any names or any details that you don't want to be broadcast. So, without further ado, let's start our first session. As I said, this is to explore the perspective and role of the employer in supporting and protecting in-house legal teams. And to join me for this, I'd like to invite Natalie, Phil, Luke, and Jackie to the stage. I'll sit here. Whoops. Thank you very much. So, Natalie, Phil, Luke, and Jackie, you will no doubt say a bit more about your roles as we get into the discussion. There are more details in the biographies which you've got in your programme. Just briefly, we've got Luke, who's a senior lawyer in the government legal department, Natalie, legal director at National Highways, Jackie, who is the head of regulatory policy at the SRA, and Phil, who's a director at the Financial Reporting Council. Very, very big welcome to you all. Thank you very much for joining me here. To start with, I've got some questions to kick off the discussion before opening out to the audience. We spoke a lot at last year's event about the challenge of wearing two hats as a solicitor working in-house, being an employee as well as a solicitor and legal advisor. And we've heard a lot at the SRA about, from solicitors about the difficulties they have in navigating this. So with this in mind, I'd quite like to flip the perspective and ask as my first question, what can employers do? What can employers do to support solicitors working in-house? Jackie, can I start with you? Because as I mentioned earlier, we've got a piece of guidance directly speaking to employers. What does our guidance for employers say about this?
Okay, so hopefully most of you here know that we've got guidance specifically for employers, and if you don't know, then there's been a spectacular comms failure on the part of the SRA. So we produced the guidance following feedback from the in-house community, including many of you sitting here today, talking about the sort of unique challenges that you face as a regulated professional, regulated by us, working in an organisation that's not regulated by us. And how that can mean that sometimes employers inadvertently may ask you to do things that you feel brings you into conflict with those obligations. And so the reason that we produced the guidance was to start to build that understanding with employers of what it means for you to be regulated by the SRA and what they can do to support you in doing that. So there's a number of things that we say. There's quite a lot in that guidance, and I've just sort of tried to pull out some key things to sort of raise today. So a key thing that we say employers can do is have open conversations with you and have them early about what your regulatory obligations are and what that means in the particular role that you're in. So that they can start to understand that. We also suggest that it would be helpful to set mutual expectations of roles, and again, as early as possible, thinking about your regulatory obligations. And we say that would be really helpful to have it in or alongside your contract of employment, and I know that some people have found that quite helpful. Something else that's really important, and which I know sounds obvious, but we know from our thematic review can be an issue, is to not ask you to do anything that conflicts with your regulatory obligations. And so we've provided a bit of a list in the guidance of the sort of things that, again, sound obvious, but things that you definitely shouldn't be asked to do. And so I won't go through them all because it's quite a list, but things like approving, supporting, facilitating, or ignoring dishonest action. Or asking you to do anything that would be dishonest, such as backdating of documents or getting rid of things like correspondence that you might think may be needed later in litigation. Also, not ask you to breach any duties of confidentiality or legal professional privilege that are owed properly, or also not asking you to pretend they're owed when they're not as well. And also acting outside of your competence. So an issue that I know many of you have experienced is saying, well, you're a solicitor, so you know everything about all the areas of law on which I need advice about. So we're also pointing out that that's just unrealistic to expect your in-house solicitor to know everything about every area of law, and so be ready for your solicitor to say, actually, I need external advice on this. Also, another key thing is to make sure that the systems and processes are in place that you need to support those professional obligations. So we're talking about things such as making sure you know who you are advising, that you have the information that you need, and that you have the realistic timeframes there so that you can deliver that successfully. So thinking about safeguards to protect against conflicts with your regulatory obligations. And so, you know, for example, thinking carefully about reward and recognition for in-house solicitors. And so you'll be relieved to know that we're not saying that you shouldn't be allowed bonuses as an in-house solicitor, but that actually that needs a little bit of careful thought. So maybe not a bonus system that's focused solely on delivering a particular deal, but maybe thinking about the way in which that deal is delivered in a way that meets the sort of legal and risk appetite of the organisation in which you work and complies with your regulatory obligations. Also allowing the legal function to participate in leadership and decision-making across the business, but that we also stress that you shouldn't be penalised if you decline to have a particular role or take a particular action where you think there's a likelihood that that will lead to a conflict with your regulatory obligations. Providing appropriate levels of access to organisational decision makers, and stressing that you need clear reporting lines all the way up to the top of your organisation, including the board where that might be appropriate. Encouraging a speak-up culture so that you're not disciplined or victimised for raising concerns about potential wrongdoing or refusing to act yourself where you think it will compromise your regulatory obligations. And sort of the last thing I wanted to talk about was making sure that there's a system in place to give you the support you need to provide a competent service, because we know that can be a real challenge in organisations. So making sure that the processes and resources are there to enable you to keep your professional knowledge up to date, and that the organisation manages cost pressures so that it doesn't compromise your ability to deliver that competent service.
Thanks, Jackie. Luke, can I come to you next? Some of what Jackie said there feels like, as she said, sort of no-brainer kind of things, principles, but she mentioned processes and resources there. So the Government Legal Department obviously is a very large organisation, but I know you wear other hats and you work with both the Law Society and the Leeds Law Society, and you'll have experience working with members in a wide range of different organisations. Do you have any thoughts that might help those who don't have sort of large teams or large organisations to lean on?
Yeah, so I mean, obviously I'm preaching to the choir probably with this crowd, but most in-house teams are much smaller than the Government Legal Department. That goes without saying. I mean, I think we've about 2,000 lawyers, I think, give or take. So I'm sure there's probably a few people who are quite jealous of that kind of resource. But I do, like you say, wear a few hats, and you know, working with the Law Society and Leeds Law Society, you meet a lot of in-house counsel in much smaller teams than that. Sometimes even a sole general counsel, and you know, get to know what sort of the issues that face them every day. But even sort of personally, even though I am obviously part of an incredibly large department of 2,000 lawyers, my day job is advising the probation service on all of their commercial issues, and that team there is, to use the technical panel, it's 2 FTEs, so there's 3 of us, 2 of which are part-time, and I'm the only full-time lawyer doing that. And that's about a £300 million a year budget we're talking about. So there's that, you know, when we're talking about that as a mini team, that you know, I sort of get some of the familiar things that people tell me when they are the sole GC or maybe part of a very small team for a big company. But the thing that I always find from speaking to people who've experienced that is they often, you know, the common thread seems to be the same, whether it's a team of 1 or 5 or 500. The absolute critical thing of knowing your client, as in knowing your employer, and you know, getting to know what is their risk appetite, what is their motivation, what is their driver, what do they want from you, and knowing all of these things, if not from day one, but as soon as you possibly can is completely critical. And I think getting to understand what they expect from you as their lawyer. I think, Jackie touched on about, talking about competence. I mean, that's really critical. I was speaking to a GC last year, and he sort of started, and quite early on, the sort of head of HR came to him and was like, "Oh, well, you're our GC, you can deal with this." And he was like, "That's an employment issue. I'm not an employment lawyer." And they're like, "What did we hire a lawyer for if you're not going to do the law stuff?" And it is a bit like, well, no, I was here to do the M&As and the sort of contract stuff. I've not done employment since I was in law school 20 years ago, so don't ask me. And I think the CFO, unfortunately, was a bit surprised that he'd have to fork out a check for an external lawyer to deal with it. So there's probably a bit of a breakdown in communication there somewhere along the line between, them deciding to hire an in-house lawyer and, thinking about what the expectations for that role was. It's probably, a slightly extreme example, but I'm sure it resonates with people in the audience that, there can be a difference of opinion between what an employer expects their lawyer to do and what the lawyer is actually comfortable doing. Sometimes, yes, ethically. I spoke to quite an experienced GC a few months ago, and he said there's been twice he's had to resign from post because he was asked to do things that were completely unethical in his view, and he was basically left with no choice. He was either quit or, face doing something definitely unethical or potentially unlawful. So he was like, I quit. And, he acknowledged that he was senior enough and experienced enough that he could, walk out of one job and walk into another. And he was like, look, I didn't have to worry about my mortgage being paid next month because I could land a new job. He said, he's explained to me, look, I've got a lot of sympathy for colleagues, potentially, especially ones that are a bit more junior, where they're like, oh, well, if I don't do this, where's the next job coming from? And that's a real pressure that a lot of in-house counsel, will feel. And I'm sure, will resonate with people in the audience. So I think there has to be that clear communication between the in-house lawyer and whoever they're reporting to, or whoever the head of legal is reporting to. There's often this discussion, should the head of in-house legal speak directly to this CEO, should be the CFO, should be someone else. It's a conversation probably as old as time, but whoever it is has to understand what the limits and responsibilities of that in-house lawyer are going to be. And I mean, before I say this, I will stress the SRA haven't paid me to say this part. But the document, which is aimed at employers, I think is a really helpful document. And to be honest, if I was going into a private in-house role, I think I would sort of say, I want you to effectively sign up to this before I sign my contract to work for you. It's, it's that fundamental. I think when you look at legal failures, if you can call them that way, like the post office being the most prime example, one of the really critical things that seems to be forgotten along the way is that every lawyer's first responsibility is to the court, not to their employer. And obviously that's hard because it's the employer who's paying the paycheck. You don't get to rock along to the Royal Courts of Justice and go, I'm a really good boy, I did something I've complied with all my obligations, can you pay my salary please? They'll say no. Your employer is the one paying the bills, but that's what you've signed up for, that's your oath is to the court first and foremost, and that's absolutely fundamental. And that seems to be, from my perspective, the root failure where a lot of these things go wrong is where people, they take off the responsibility to the court hat and they put on the who's paying the bills hat, which, like I've said, is an understandable thing, but it really does drive a lot of the issues. And so I think that conversation starts from day one and bears repeating throughout. And I think joined onto that is really critical. You have to understand, well, what external resource am I going to be able to bring in, whether that's barristers, external law firms, other experts. And if the answer is, well, the budget is zero, then the answer can be, okay, well, fine, but then you have to understand how much I can realistically expect to do as your in-house counsel. You can't expect me to deal with every, tribunal case that you might come in your way, or you can't expect me to, read through 800,000 pages of disclosure on an M&A deal, so there has to be a sense of realism, and that has to be, I think, built in absolutely from day one, and that's absolutely critical. Otherwise, you're off on the wrong path right from the outset.
Really interesting. So, I mean, it really kind of came out loud and clear from what you were saying there, that setting of mutual expectations and that continuing conversation. And also something as simple as just making sure that your employer understands the role description, what they want a lawyer to do, what is the job that they're wanting to task their lawyers to do. Mentioning, when things go wrong or when people are in that difficult situation. I mean, I think, our guidance does talk about employers, responsibility for encouraging a speak-up culture, and looking at sort of reporting lines for raising concerns, and it also talks about governance and the way in which governance can help support that. And I'd quite like to sort of touch on that now and ask the panel's view about the role of governance in organisations. Natalie, if I can come to you first on this, because I understand that National Highways is a bit of a hybrid organisation because it has public functions and public accountability, but it's actually a company with shareholders and a board of directors. Yeah. Can you explain how that works, and also how that works for the legal team and what their role is within that?
We are quite a unique organisation, and we have a slightly unusual governance sort of set up. So I work for a company called National Highways, and we are the highways agency for the strategic road network in England. So we are government owned, but we are limited by shares, but that one share is entirely owned by the Secretary of State for Transport on behalf of the government. We have a board and exec who are accountable to Secretary of State, but then we also have some degree of independence from government to make decisions and manage our own operations and funding. So we are very different from government legal department. So how do we work within this governance? Well, we're quite lucky, I think, because we were established in 2015, which is a really key time for establishing the business's governance. And our recently retired General Counsel was the sort of founding lawyer and was there at the time, along with a small group of senior lawyers. And we were very lucky to have a clear role in establishing and growing the business from day one and carving out the policies and the way we work. And we were able, from that day, to establish the importance of having a legal role on the leadership side from an early stage, and how important that was. And also how important it was to have an independent legal directorate, so where the lawyers were managed within and by other lawyers who understand their professional obligations, and not by senior leaders who from other directorates who may have sort of different motives, obviously perhaps more around successive schemes. So we can avoid incentivising and sort of, our objectives being tied to sort of business decisions. So that helped. We were off to a really good start, which we were very lucky. Our General Counsel is now very recently retired, and we have a new interim General Counsel. So she now is in a position where she has visibility across the whole business. So she sits on the board, and she attends every board meeting, reports to the board by way of a legal report. And she's also a member of most of our executive committees. So she's there, she's present, she's embedded in the business. Some of our legal senior leadership team are also, they come to some of those exec committee meetings, or they attend other SLT meetings within the business. So we're members of lots of different panels across the business, which is really important. It's allowed us to become embedded at quite a senior level. We're able then to have some say in the business appetite for the legal and regulatory risk, and also make the company aware of our professional obligations at a senior level. And I've made that sound really fluffy and brilliant, and it's not always. We have some challenges. It is a really grey area for an in-house team. It's not, I think that any of us had ever worked in an organisation like that. I don't think there are many of us. So we've got a lot of governance to balance. So we have to ensure our advice is compliant with our licence. We are government owned, so we work under a licence. We have to comply with company law and regulation. We are a company. We're a registered company's house. We're accountable to our exec and our board and our non-exec directors, but also our business senior leadership team, and we have to report to them appropriately. But then we have another group of the DfT shareholder team, and we have the UK government investment team, who obviously act on behalf of government investments. So we have to account to them, and they have to account to Parliament. So it's fairly high-level reporting. Alongside this, and we have to think about, I think, what's been touched on already, we have to think about our remaining independent and impartial, and doing that while conflicting with our sort of professional obligations, client confidentiality, acting in the best interests of our client, making sure we know, I think it's mentioned, who is our client. It's the business, but we have obviously lots of other people to think about, DFT being one of them. We've got our own internal company values and behaviours, which is quite similar to the Civil Service Code of Conduct, but we're not civil servants, but we do have a duty to safeguard the wider interest and manage the public purse. So it can be really tricky to make sure you've ticked all of those boxes, and then you're a lawyer at the same time, so you've also got to think about your regulatory body and making sure you're ticking those boxes. There are positives. Because we've become so embedded in the business, we're really well placed. Our general counsel and senior leadership team are really well placed to identify legal risk and intervene at an early stage if we need to. Almost all of the time. Doesn't always work, and we've built a relationship with our colleagues, and so I think we don't work in a legal silo. We are part of the business, but a separate directorate.
I think that point about being embedded in projects and in the kind of governance arrangements has really kind of comes across from what you say. Although with the complexities, I think to navigate actually that importance of being embedded has really kind of come across. And I wanted Phil to bring you in here because, of course, the FRC has responsibility for, kind of owns the corporate governance code. So I wondered if you could tell us a bit more about that. And recently there have been some changes to the code. So could you tell us a bit about those and how the code might support solicitors working in organisations?
Yeah, and actually I think some of the changes to the code are particularly relevant in the discussion we're having around systems and processes, and you talked about that a little bit earlier. I think it's always useful to go back. The code's actually over 30 years old now. It was first issued in 1992, and it's always useful to go back to what we actually mean by, or how corporate governance is defined. And it's defined as the system by which companies are directed and controlled, and it gives the board the responsibility for owning that system. I think that's really relevant in this conversation, but in particular, in the last year, as many of you know, we've revised the code. It was a fairly limited change, but the main change in the new code, which is now applicable for this current year, it is emphasising or making clear that the board have accountability for its system of internal controls, or the company's system of internal controls. Now, that's always been the case in the code. They've always been responsible for internal controls and responsible for their operation. But what has changed in the revision to the code is requiring directors to assign a declaration that those controls are effective. And that's really important because I think it provides a much stronger basis for companies to evidence their internal control framework. And I think what's really important to this conversation is, of course, solicitors and legal advisors are very much part of that internal control framework, and therefore part of the system for which boards are accountable for. So I think the Corporate Governance Code is very helpful to some of the conversations that we're having around the importance of internal controls, the importance of the role that you all have in that system of internal control.
And of course, having a sort of mature system of internal controls helps to sort of safeguard against sort of individuals, strong personalities, or people who might try and put pressure on solicitors or kind of get round, the right and proper way of doing things. So I think it all kind of works as a sort of virtuous circle in a way, I think. And can I just ask you, what does the Corporate Governance Code say about sort of corporate culture and tone from the top? Because I'm quite interested to look at this role of kind of senior leaders and the individuals who are at the top of organisations.
Yeah, so I mean the board has always had responsibility, or its duty is actually to promote the long-term sustainable success of the company. And what that practically means is that it should be responsible for establishing the purpose, the values and the strategy of the company, and aligning or satisfying itself that the culture is aligned to that purpose, those values, and that strategy that it's put in place. And I think it's really important, and the code very much emphasises that directors are required to act with integrity, to lead from the top, to set the tone from the top of the organisation, and promote that culture of integrity, of values, and really sort of create that environment, that internal control system, which allows, people to express, where they have an opinion, where they're concerned about the direction or the control framework not operating effectively, to allow for a system for that to be escalated to the board.
Just a warning, I'm going to be coming out before too long to ask for questions from the floor, so be thinking about what you might want to ask. But before I do that, Natalie, I just wondered if you had any thoughts about the role of senior leaders in organisations.
Yeah, I think it's really important for all senior leaders, and I think not just members of the exec team and CEO, anyone who I think is managing anyone within the business needs to be seen to be leading by example and role modelling a really good relationship with their legal team to the rest of the business. And this probably can sound really obvious, but I think they need to be seen to be using their lawyers well and sending the message the in-house legal team are part of the business and have an important role to play in sort of the decision-making side of things. Bringing lawyers in at an early stage, again, obvious, but it doesn't always happen, or you're not always invited in. And not just when things have gone wrong, so not to come in just to tick a box to say we passed this under the lawyer's nose and they nodded. It's to bring them in and bring them as part of the team, and to take our advice and be seen to be acting on it. Perhaps not always, but just if they agree with it, to be seen to be using it, and giving us a seat at all relevant meetings and including us in emails that we need to be included in, and allowing us to, I think, to be seen to be questioning decisions and raising concerns, and doing that without detriment to our careers. To be able to say, I don't think you can do that, or you're not doing it quite, you're not quite following the statute, and then not being excluded from the team. And also, as senior leaders, to be seen to be enabling funding necessary professional development, which, because we sometimes need specialist training that the business can't provide, to be seen to be acknowledging that that's needed. I think I've got an example of our retired General Counsel. I'm sorry, I've mentioned him before, but he has a saying that he says quite a lot, speak truth to power. And he says it so regularly that it's become his motto. And STTP is a bit of an in-joke in our directorate. but jokes aside, he does do that. He did that. And that enabled the legal team then to normalise this and enable us to then go to be able to push back on instructions or question or just challenge our clients who are our colleagues as well. So it's not always easy. And know that we would be supported from the top if we did do that, certainly from sort of General Counsel perspective. And if you do all of those things, I think if you encourage your colleagues, your employers to do all of those things, and if you do sometimes have to say no, you can't do that. And but if you've done it as part of the team from the beginning, I think we found that the clients come on that horrible journey with you, and they know why you've had to say no, and they understand the reasons behind it.
Thank you. And I just, Jackie, if I could just ask you, talking about sort of, people at the top of organisations and those with those leadership roles. As I mentioned earlier, we did produce this sort of summary document for boards and executive leaders. And can I just ask you why that was important?
Yeah, definitely. So we obviously think our guidance is really helpful. It contains lots of useful detail. It's well written and things, but it can be long. Our guidance, so what's the realistic chances of a board or a senior leader in an organisation reading something that can, be 10, 15 pages long? And so we wanted to help boards and senior leaders to understand more about the solicitors that they are employing and the obligations that they have as a regulated professional and what the core of those were. So we hope in producing a really short, succinct document that summarises that, we can help to facilitate those discussions between organisations and their solicitors about the sort of mutual expectations, which I think we've all talked about mutual expectations today. And we've already heard some stories about general counsels and other senior leaders taking those documents to boards and saying, look, we really need to read this. And it really helps that it's short. So including the guidance in the pack was really important because senior leaders have that significant influence over whether in-house legal teams can do their jobs effectively. If solicitors feel unsupported, or if their legal advice is routinely challenged, then the organisation can be exposed to greater risk and regulatory risk as well as legal risk. But when the leadership actively supports and engages with the legal function, it can strengthen governance and it can improve risk management and help to make sure that the organisation has ethical decision making embedded within it. So the guidance definitely encourages boards and those executive leaders sort of recognise in-house solicitors as strategic partners rather than advisors who are just brought in when a problem occurs.
Thanks, Jackie. Luke, can I just come back to you? Because, Natalie, you mentioned the Civil Service Code. And obviously, Luke, in the GLD, there are those wider obligations under the Civil Service Code. And I just sort of wondered if you could let us know, and others might have something similar in their organisations, whether it's a kind of code of conduct or statutory principles in public organisations. But I just wondered how, if you could give us a flavour of sort of how it affects the culture and how it affects your relationships with colleagues, the fact that there's that sort of wider code in place.
Yeah, so I mean, well, our sort of motto, or strapline, whatever you might call it for GLD, is to help the government of the day govern well within the rule of law. And that sort of says a lot in not very many words, which is quite unloyally, really, in my experience. So they've done well there. Maybe it was written by one of our comms team. But what that really gets to the heart of is that, well, first of all, we are civil servants, so when the government changes, the priorities change, we change with them. It's not about what you think about the policy, it's about what the government wants to deliver, and that you help them do that in the most effective and value for money way, complying with all of our obligations, both national, international, and everything else. But also that we do that then with the rule of law, that's like the ultimate backstop. So it's good I can now talk about this because it's now published on gov.uk, the Attorney General's advice to GLD lawyers on risk, which used to be sort of hidden away internally, and now it's public. And the ultimate sort of backstop is if something is unlawful, we have to raise it, and we have basically, if I was reviewing something and said, no, there's absolutely no way that this is lawful, I have to report it to my boss, and she probably has to report it to hers, and it goes up the chain. And ultimately, the sort of backstop goes all the way up to the Attorney General. Luckily, I've never got that far, because it sounds quite scary. And quite time-consuming, if I'm being really honest. But there has been a few occasions where I've had to have that conversation with clients where, like, look, there's just no way what you're trying to do here fits within the regulations. Like, there's bending the rules, and then there's breaking them, and this is definitely breaking them. And luckily, that is very rare. I'm pleased to say, the government's not doing this on a daily basis. But there are times where you have to say to clients, like, look, there is just absolutely no way. And, it's not an easy conversation to have, it's not a nice conversation to have, but you have that sort of backstop of, well, this has come from the Attorney General, so this has come from, the top of the shop. And there's no way around it. And, sometimes, I had a client swear blind that I was wrong, so we got external legal advice, which agreed with me, and they still said I was wrong. So we got KC's advice, who agreed with me, and they still said I was wrong. And I was a bit like, well, and so eventually, got escalated to their boss's boss, and they went, oh, why are you ignoring the legal advice? This is a complete waste of time. So that was a fun 2 weeks. But like I said, luckily that's incredibly rare. But that's the backstop. What's more common is you get the situation where you say to clients, like, look, we can make a perfectly credible legal argument here, but it's probably, if this goes to court, there's a real strong chance we could lose. Mm-hmm. So, you have to, I don't decide. Mm-hmm. I say this to the clients all the time. I'm not a decider. I'm an advisor, and that it's if you want to make that decision, fine. I can only give you the advice. I can take the horse to water, but I can't make it drink. And so as long as they don't cross that line of going into unlawful territory, I can only tell you how risky I think it is. I mean, luckily, it's not again, it's not super common. I'm saying something's a really high risk. And being a lawyer, I mean, hands up if anybody's ever got a barrister's opinion that said, 100% you will win this case, or 100% you will lose.
In fact, trying to get a number is quite difficult.
It's a little bit like getting hen's teeth. But, but there is always scope, and there is always where there is a will, there is a way. And the conversation we have to have with colleagues is within JLD, especially when people come in externally or junior colleagues, and they go, sometimes they think, look, this is really high risk, and I'm like, I know, but what we've got to appreciate, the client in our case is balancing the legal risk is one aspect, and the other aspect is this is a crucial service for the operation of the probation service, of prisons, of hospitals, or whatever it might be. So, they might go, thanks for your legal advice, we'll take it under advisement and we'll deal with the consequences if it comes to it. But the risk of widespread prison riots vastly outweighs us, having to deal with a disgruntled supplier suing us. That's unfortunate, but that's what we have to live with. But a prison riot is about as serious as it gets. So, there is those conversations have to go on. So that's what the Civil Service Code is all about. Yes, staying within the bounds of the Civil Service Code, being ethical and everything else, but there is always a certain level of practicality and pragmatism which has to go along with it. And that's what sometimes we have people come into JLD, like I say, externally, or junior lawyers at the start of the career, that's a skill that they have to learn, that you have to give your advice and then let the client make the decision, and they have to live with it. It's not your call to make. But sometimes you do have to sort of knock heads together with clients and say, look, it's not going to be me who's sat on the witness stand getting grilled by a senior barrister raking you over the hot coals for 3 hours. Why did you do this? Why did you do that? Why did you decide this? And they go, what? And I go, well, yeah, well, I'm just a lawyer. I'm not giving a witness statement about this. You're signing the contract. You're going to be grilled on this. What's your answer going to be? And they go, oh, good question. I'll come back to you.
And legal advice is never really the kind of the winning answer in that kind of discussion or debate either.
Yeah. Whatever people's regulatory obligations over and above the legal one, as a lawyer, applies to their organisations are critical, and you have to use them at the right time is what I always advise colleagues. It's not like, you drop in the Civil Service Code or whatever it might be, at the right time. If you go to that minute one, day one with a client, they're going to be like, who's this guy? We're never going to get anything done. Like there's a document produced by Treasury, which is called Managing Public Money, which is all about everything we're supposed to do to manage public money, hence the name. It's not a thrilling document, I'll be honest, but it is very important to what we do. And if a client comes to you with an idea, day one, when they're in a bit of a blue sky thinking stage, and you just go, oh, I don't know if this goes past managing public money, they're not going to thank you, because like, well, yeah, we know, but we're just trying to formulate an idea. But when they're a bit further down the line, if you go, I'm not sure how you're going to square that with managing public money, then that should really be pause for thought for them to think, okay, maybe we need to, maybe not quite go back to the drawing board, but go back a step or two and think of another strategy.
What I'm really interested is that idea that actually what the code does is it kind of can normalise those risk management discussions and, help with non-lawyer colleagues, encourage those to be seen as part of the process and part of something that's valuable to the organisation, as well as the value that lawyers bring as part of those conversations. So I'm going to come out to you now to see if you've got any questions. And I'm going to stand up because I realise I have a real blind spot right here, so I want to make sure I'm not missing anybody. And I'm going to put on my glasses so I can see everybody's hands. We've got a couple of hands here. Jennifer, I think you're first.
Thank you. Good morning. Question for Phil, actually. So every person in this room has an indirect influence over board members to some degree, and we should absolutely maximise that. But I think that you at the FRC might be the only organisational representation in the room that has a direct influence. And given the questions how Juliet framed this around what can boards be doing, what can employers be doing, how do we shift the emphasis from it being about lawyers persuading and actually make it about the responsibility of boards and leadership. And the SRA data show that 1 in 10 in-house lawyers are put under ethical pressure, put under pressure to compromise their professional and regulatory duties, which is a lot of pressure, a lot of people. And it's pretty common, or rather maybe not uncommon, for a lawyer to resign, and we had some examples given on the stage of that people tap out because the choice is between capitulating and resigning. And I wonder what you think about that. So as the FRC, does that demonstrate an efficacy of the system of internal controls that you require of your organisations that are within your cohort that you're looking at? Or would you say that there's a problem there? And if there's a problem there, what is it that could be done at a systemic level that's way above all the people in this room, perhaps with the FRC? Some of us had suggested that lawyers as a role should be referenced in guidance of the FRC so that it's not just a nebulous concept of what in system of internal controls is, but actually there's a reference to, hey, you need to talk to your lawyers just like you need to talk to internal audit, et cetera, et cetera. So wonder on your view on that.
Yeah. So no, thank you very much for the question, and I recognise the dilemma that's faced by solicitors. I'm actually an accountant by background, and actually there's a real read across here because, you know, often accountants face the same kind of dilemma where a board is wanting to do something or a CEO is wanting to do something, and you know the accountant needs to be comfortable that that's in line with accounting practice, et cetera, and we've got the same sort of responsibilities to our institute as well as the employer as well. So there's a real kind of read across there, and I understand the dilemma. I think one of the reasons we've introduced the requirement for boards to sign off on the effectiveness of internal controls is to encourage boards to think about, well, what's the evidence trail behind that? You know, if they're signing to say, you know, the set of internal controls is effective, what evidence do they have that the internal control system is in place and includes the right people within that system? And to my mind, legal advice is such an important part of that internal control framework, just as accountants, I hope, are as well. So I think the FRC is, by making that change in the code, I think that will help emphasise the need for effective controls to be evident throughout the system. And whilst I know it doesn't specify lawyers or in the guidance itself, I think legal advice should be part of that internal control framework. I don't know whether that helps, but I certainly recognise the dilemma.
Thank you. Richard.
Thank you. We've heard a lot about general counsels and senior legal leadership engaging. There is no definition of what a general counsel is. In fact, the general counsel doesn't exist in any statutory or regulatory environment as a definitional. And you don't actually have to have studied law or be a lawyer in any shape or form to be a general counsel. We often see a lot of companies have general counsels because they are the only lawyer in the firm, and they might be 1 year qualified, if qualified at all. And that creates a significant power dynamic problem for those junior lawyers. How do you think the SRA should engage with that community of people who just don't have the experiences or capacity to have the dialogue we've been talking about with people who are significantly more senior, older, possibly they've brought the lawyer only in to try and save money, not because they want a general counsel? How do you see that being navigated?
Who wants to come to this one first? I don't know if anybody has a... Jackie, I don't know if you want to have a word on the SRA, on the SRA's sort of position, and
I mean, I think we recognise that is a real challenge. General counsel is not a protected term, and as you say, we know that it's used sort of at all levels of lawyer, and as you say, sometimes because there is a single lawyer, the title is there. It's something that we need to give some thought to at the SRA. We've got our virtual reference group, and there are lawyers of all levels, and some who are the sole lawyer in their organisation, and some who head up whole legal teams like Luke in that VRG. And I guess there's a question for us as to whether we need to stratify within that, and whether there's particular assistance we need to provide for lawyers who find themselves in that sort of sole position. It's not something that we have in place at the moment. And also whether we have thought about whether we need to give guidance about the different terms that you might use for your lawyers, and when general counsel might be appropriate, although, as I say, it's not a protected job title.
I wonder, Luke or Natalie, I don't know if in your organisations you've kind of given any thought, and I think there's a question there, isn't there, about protecting and supporting sort of junior colleagues as they come through, and particularly if they're in a situation where they are sort of parachuted into kind of quite senior roles at quite an early part of their career.
I mean, so one of the perks I always say for junior lawyers joining GLD is you get into rooms that you wouldn't get anywhere close to in private practice. You know, you will be working on projects of a much bigger size, much bigger complexity, a much earlier stage in your career. So that is, overall, definitely a perk. You know, it's exciting work and interesting work, and you get to do the type of work that you probably went to law school for. But at the same time, that does bring its own pressure. And I think we're fortunate that within GLD, you know, it's not, you are sort of to a certain extent thrown in at the deep end, but it's not completely sink or swim. The responsibility is always on your line manager to make sure you don't drown, if to talk to this analogy a bit further. You know, it's, so I will sometimes say to really junior colleagues, like, look, draft me this advice, and I don't expect it to be right, but, you know, then we'll talk it through, and they come to you quite nervously, and you look at it and you go, okay. I'll pull out the metaphorical red pen, but you know, you have to guide them from that stage. So then a couple of years later, they're this incredible, lawyer with all this experience and all this skill, and do you throw them in when you sort of throw them into a client meeting where they're going to have to deliver the advice sort of verbally? Is a tricky question, and is a judgment call. But really, the way I see it is that has to be, you always have to be a bit of a shield as someone's, senior colleague. You know, it's your neck on the line, not theirs. Especially if they're a trainee or an NQ. If they mess up, you've messed up, because you should have been responsible as well. I mean, the trainee that's just rotated out of our team, he was a first seat trainee, and he asked him to do some advice, produced the written advice, and then the client was like, "Oh, can we talk through it?" And so I talked to the trainee before we had the meeting with the client, and I had him ahead of, okay, if he can talk me through his legal advice in a coherent way and answer my questions, I can put him in front of the client, because I know what the client's like, and they're not. They're fairly easygoing. And he absolutely nailed all of the points, and I was like, fantastic. I was like, we're going to go into this meeting, and I'm just going to sit there and not say a thing. You're going to lead. And he was like, really? And I was like, yeah, go for it. Had we had that sort of pre-meeting, and he'd been a bit, and I'd asked him some of the questions, he'd been like, I don't know, then it would not have been the time to sort of, get him to lead that meeting. So I appreciate that we've got the benefit there of, the resource, to be able to do that. That's not always universal, but that is definitely the approach that I would always encourage when it was possible. As the senior lawyer, it's your neck on the block, really, not your junior colleagues, especially, like I say, if they're a trainee. Your name should be on the on the line as much as theirs, without wanting to make it sound quite so perilous as it maybe does. But hopefully I've made my point.
Thank you. I had a question over here. Thanks. Thank you. Got one, and then if we've got time, I'll come to you too.
The organisation that I'm working for we've recently been looking at how we manage our legal team. So we've been looking at matrix managing the team, with embedding the team more. And so your advice and guidance, as it were, from SRA was very timely. I noticed that it wasn't explicit as to the sort of in-house models there should be. And I was just interested from yourself on the panel if you had a view on if you have if one end of that spectrum is diffuse and one end is completely centralised as a legal model, where do those boundaries lie?
So it's a really good question, and I think I'll come to Jackie in a moment. But obviously we're writing guidance that covers sort of 34,500 solicitors in 6,000 organisations, and really recognise there's going to be a real sort of broad church there. I think what our guidance does talk about is the value of being able to go up a legal chain, particularly when you are looking for when you're sort of reporting legal and regulatory risks, so that you've got a route there through sort of lawyers who also have regulatory obligations. And I think that is something that certainly we've heard from a lot of people we've engaged with as being something that is quite an important sort of protection and support in terms of sort of the governance. I think going as far as saying, you have to organise it in one way or another is quite challenging, particularly we don't regulate the organisations themselves and can't sort of say, you must do X or Y. But I think that there are different models, and certainly legal teams where you have people embedded in different sort of projects and have that matrix arrangement can work well. But the flip side, as I say, is the value in being able to have that kind of professional identity and have those sort of reporting lines. Jackie, I don't know if there's anything you'd like to sort of add on that point.
I mean, I think I would echo all of that really, and just say that I think we recognise in the guidance that there's those different models and there's positives and negatives to both. If you've got lawyers embedded in your different teams, then they're more able to understand the challenges and the business and the projects going on in those teams and maybe give that sort of tailored advice. But at the same time, if you're not line managed by a lawyer, then that can bring its own challenges, and you might feel more isolated if you're the only lawyer in that team and you're the only one subject to those particular regulatory obligations. And so sometimes centralised legal teams can feel more supported, can feel that they're stronger in their ability to raise what their regulatory obligations are, and stronger in resisting those sort of challenges to their regulatory obligations, but they're not as close to the business maybe. So there's pros and cons of both, and we don't, as the SRA, come down on one side or the other of what that is, but we more air what the sort of positives, negatives and risks are in that.
I've got another question here. We're running out of time, but I'm going to use chair's prerogative and come to you, because I know you had your hand up a little while ago.
Yeah, just a quick one really, just reflecting on being made to be general counsel because you're the only lawyer in the building. And to be honest, that's very worrying, for that individual lawyer. I just wonder whether it goes to the competence and the individual responsibility of that lawyer, whether they've got the competency to be put themselves in that position, and whether there is any merit in the SRA doing some guidance, really just to provide some warning and guidance to people who are potentially putting themselves in that position, not fully appreciating, quite often early in their career, what they're letting themselves in for. It's a bit like putting yourself in the position of monitoring officer in local government, without really understanding how the whole system works. So that was all. It's more of an observation, really.
Well, it's a very good call, and as I said earlier, we are looking at developing some of those slightly more detailed points that can kind of help to explore some of the themes and issues in our guidance, but actually using some real-life scenarios and bringing some of these things to life. So that's a very good shout. I appreciate apologies. I think I need to wrap up now and come to Jim Baxter. But if you haven't had a chance to ask your question, and I know there was a question here, apologies. We will all be around, during the break. So please do come, and hopefully we can carry on the conversation then. But for now, can I just say thank you very, very much to my panel, Phil, Jackie, Natalie, and Luke. Thanks ever so much.